What if the way you react, feel, or even struggle today isn't your fault? What if it all traces back to your childhood? Not just memories, but how your brain was wired to survive. Dr. Gabor spent 12 years studying why so many of us carry invisible wounds and how emotional pain shapes who we become. If you've ever felt too sensitive, overwhelmed, or misunderstood, this might be the explanation you've been waiting for. Let's explore how healing truly begins from within.
If you've ever felt unheard, unseen, or like the wounds from your past still hold you back, you're not alone. This space is for you. Here, we heal, we grow, and we rediscover who we truly are. Beyond the pain, beyond the past. And if you're ready to step into your healing journey and finally embrace your authentic self, hit that subscribe button. Because your inner child matters, and together, we can rewrite your story. And before we dive in, I want you to affirm this. Drop "I am healing" in the comments. Let's remind ourselves, and each other.
So for 12 years, I worked in Vancouver, British Columbia's downtown Eastside, which is North America's most concentrated area of drug use. We have more drug users there in a few square block radius than anywhere in the States or anywhere else in Canada, in fact, anywhere in Europe.
Wow.
And so I was there for 12 years. And a significant percentage of my patients clearly had ADHD that had not been diagnosed. Now, let's look at the commonalities. First of all, both addicts and people with ADHD lack impulse control. Like somebody said about addiction, is that the problem is not free will, not lack of free. No, the problem in addiction is not lack of free will, but lack of a free won't.
Lack of a free
Won't.
Oh.
They have nothing to say no with, because that circuitry didn't develop. Okay, number one. Number two, addictions all work on the dopamine system, which is what is affected in ADHD as well. So stimulant addicts, like crystal meth addicts, cocaine addicts, nicotine addicts, caffeine addicts, they're literally boosting their dopamine levels, which is precisely what's the issue in ADHDs as well. So if you look at the studies, something like a good 30% or more of stimulant addicts actually are diagnosable with ADHD. But again, this is studied and reported, but not much is done with it in medical practice. Furthermore, all addictions, no matter what they work on the dopamine circuitry. So that I will define addiction for you.
Okay.
As inability to give it up. That's what an addiction is. Now, let me just go sideways a little bit.
Okay.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
And you've already answered it, but according to that, notice I didn't say anything about drugs. I said any behavior.
Yeah.
Now, if I speak to a room of 1,000 people and I give that definition and I say, according to that definition, which is not controversial, let me just go sideways a little bit.
Okay.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
And you've already answered it, but according to that, notice I didn't say anything about drugs. I said any behavior.
Yeah.
Now, if I speak to a room of 1,000 people and I give that definition and I say, according to that definition, which is not controversial, if you ever had an addictive pattern in your life, just raise your hand. And out of 1,999
Yes.
will raise their hands, and there's one liar who won't, but basically it's almost everybody. Now, here's the second question. And I don't care what your addictive patterns were, whether they were to alcohol, which you mentioned, or to whatever else. Not what was wrong with it, but what was right about it. What did it give you in the short term that you wanted? So what did it give you?
Oh, well, with alcohol, it was like a sense of belonging and relief, and it was a way to turn my brain off.
Okay.
And to escape.
Okay. When do people need to escape?
When they're stressed.
When they're suffering.
Yeah.
Okay. So the addiction wasn't a disease that you had. It wasn't your primary problem. It was an attempt to solve the problem of emotional pain and isolation. Addiction is, don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain. And if you want to understand the pain, look at the person's life rather than just their genes. Okay? And so both people who are addicted and people who have ADHD often share this genes for sensitivity, which means they suffer more when circumstances aren't right. And so they're both, obviously those conditions will go together. And furthermore, to go back to dopamine, the shopping addict, the gambling addict, the pornography addict,
The social media addict,
the social media, and I have had my behavior
the
addictions.
gaming addiction
Yeah.
addict,
The
the
internet.
busyness.
You know what they're after? They're after a hit of dopamine in the brain, which they get through seeking that behavior.
And then you feel bad, though, that you did it.
Well, yeah, and I had my behavior addictions, but what I'm saying is it's all based partly on the dopamine circuitry. And
Which didn't develop
which didn't develop the way it should have. So now
because of your childhood.
exactly. So now you have to get your dopamine hit through pornography. And if you do brain scans on pornography addicts, they get multiple spikes of dopamine hits in their brain when they're,
Just like a drug addict.
yeah.
So what do you do with this information? Because it makes perfect sense. Like, I don't know how would be controversial. It makes absolutely perfect sense.
Well,
What do you do if you're listening to this and you yourself are recognizing this is you, or you're like, you are describing my spouse or my adult child or my parent or whomever in my life? Like, what do you do with this particular information of the connection between childhood conditions and development and ADHD and addiction?
May I just say one more thing about the brain?
Please.
Yeah, opiates.
Okay.
So people get addicted to heroin or OxyContin or Dilaudid, hydromorphone or codeine or whatever, fentanyl, unfortunately, which is a very dangerous one. These are opiates. They come from the opium plant in Afghanistan, or they're human manufactured copies of the same molecule. Now, and it's responsible for a lot of deaths in this country. Now, why does a plant from Afghanistan work in the human brain here in the States?
I don't know.
Well, because the opioid molecule, we have receptors for it in our brains, which means we have our internal opiate system. This is just pure brain science. And the opiate system, it's called endorphins. Endorphin means endogenous, internal, morphine-like substance. So we have an opiate system in our bodies, which affects many functions in our body from the gut to the immune system. But what do they do in the brain? If we understand opiate addiction, we have to understand what do endorphins do in the human trajectory. First of all, they provide pain relief, both physical and emotional pain relief. Our internal endorphins do that. We have to have pain in life because without pain, we don't survive because we can hurt ourselves, but we also have pain relief. So endorphins relieve pain, but not just physical pain, also emotional pain. Because the part of the brain where people experience physical pain, the suffering of physical pain, it's also where they experience the suffering of emotional pain. So the ring of emotional pain. So the endorphins, the opiates work there. That's their first role. The second role, along with dopamine, is to give you a sense of pleasure, elation, and joy. But that's rather important in human life because human life is difficult. So we have to have some expectation of pleasure, joy, relief. That's what the opiates do. That's the second thing they do. But the third thing they do, they facilitate a little thing called love. Endorphins help to feel us connected to other people. And particularly, they help feel parents connected to their kids, without which the child doesn't survive. And if you take little animals and you knock out their opiate receptors, they will not call for their mothers on separation. What would that do to them? It would kill them in the wild. So that's how important the opiates are. Now, who are these people that develop opiate addictions? People whose lives have undermined their opiate circuitry. And I had a sex trade worker in the downtown east side of Vancouver. I asked her, what did the heroin do for you? She said, the first time I did heroin, it felt like a warm, soft hug. So just like the alcohol, which gave you a more sense of belonging, it gave her a sense of being loved, a sense of warmth.
Emotional drivers of addiction. In this part of the video, explain the insights into the emotional aspects of addiction, including the feelings of belonging and comfort that substances can provide, as illustrated by a personal anecdote about heroin use.
That's why people get addicted, is because they suffer that early pain that they're trying to escape from, and because their brain circuitry was affected by adverse conditions so that these circuits didn't develop optimally. Now they have to substitute, so that's the shinny on addiction. It's not an inherited disease. It's a response to the environment, and it's not genetic, contrary to what 99% of physicians believe.
The reason why this is so important is because there is so much shame and self-blame.
Yeah.
When you have an addiction,
Yeah.
or you have something that you're struggling with like ADHD, and when
Yeah.
you understand the brain circuitry and the connection to brain development and human development and childhood conditions and experiences and how that has a direct impact
Yeah.
on the working and wiring of the
Yeah.
functioning of your brain,
Yeah.
you can separate yourself as a human being
That's right.
from the thing that caused this.
That's the whole point.
And then that allows you, from that moment of separation and detachment and objectivity, to go, oh, wait a minute.
Yeah.
I'm not to blame for this.
That's right.
This is a circuitry and a conditioning problem.
It's my
And
responsibility.
now it's my responsibility
Exactly. Yeah.
to do what I need to do with this
Yeah.
to heal it and make it better.
Exactly right. And to go back to your question about now, what do we do with this information? If you are parents of a child who's been diagnosed with, say, ADHD, then make a considered decision about whether you want a kid medicated or not. Medications can sometimes help. Sometimes they cause side effects. No child should be forced to be on medication, because no child at any age should get the message that they're only acceptable to the adults when their brain is sedated. You don't want to give that message to any child. But they can help sometimes to mitigate symptoms. They do nothing for brain development in the long term. So then the question is, can we create in this family better conditions for that child's brain to develop in more optimal ways? And yes, we can. And that has a lot to do with the emotional atmosphere in the family and the degree of understanding and connection. Not love, because that's already there, but the actual understanding and connection between the parents and the child. And I mean, that book's been out 25 years, and I've been told by so often that it totally changed the family just to read that book, and it totally changed their children.
Well, it's very empowering, because I think if you're the person struggling with the addiction or ADHD
Yeah.
or a condition like that, you feel deficient. You feel that you've done something wrong.
That's
and
right.
you can never heal while you're punishing yourself at the same time.
And the world is punishing you.
Yes.
Teachers are punishing you.
It's true.
Your parents are exasperated with you.
Yes.
When it comes to treating addiction, then it's very complex, but the person again needs to understand there's nothing wrong with them. They weren't born with any kind of disease. That addiction is a perfectly normal response to abnormal circumstances. I mean, look at all the veterans who are traumatized and they become alcoholics or opiate addicts.
And then there's the opposite study about the veterans from Vietnam
Yeah.
who were using opioids in Vietnam.
Over there.
But then came home to
That's
a
right.
supportive environment
Exactly.
and were not addicted.
Exactly. I quote that study in my book on addiction because it's such a salient fact. In fact, it's been done with laboratory rats, where they took laboratory rats and exposed them to different environmental conditions, and they tried to get them addicted to opioids. Now, those rats that were stressed and isolated and under adverse conditions, they very easily became addicted to opioids. The rats who had good conditions, you couldn't even make them addicted to opioids. Doesn't matter how much you gave them.
But the main thing is that if the environment is actually creating the conditions in your brain and body
Yeah.
for addiction and ADHD, then the environment is a huge piece of you healing this and growing in new ways and figuring out new adaptations for
Yeah.
how to heal.
Well, and I think it's not an individual process. It should be, for the most part,
Yes.
you need the social help. That's what the 12-step groups are. I have my critiques of them, but the 12 steps themselves, I think, are wonderful. And the group process is wonderful, where people can share themselves and be heard compassionately and not be shamed. They can declare their so-called dysfunctions and be accepted. So I think it's not just an individual process, but I think what's missing from the 12-step groups, unfortunately, is awareness of trauma, which is interesting because Bill W., the when I originally found it was an abandoned child, highly traumatized. And for some reason, trauma hasn't entered the conversation of the 12-step movement as much as I'd like to see it done. But again, healing should not be just seen as an individual process. It should be seen as a social process. And people that deal with addictions, they need to understand trauma.
What do you think is missing from the conversation that women need to know when it comes to diagnosing and supporting women who are largely getting late in life diagnoses of ADHD?
Yeah. I have to think here. I think what happens is when women get older, they tend to get a bit less repressed. And the tendencies that are in them that they've tried to kind of control in order to be acceptable and to fit in, it becomes intolerable for them. Particularly perimenopausally, it becomes a real chore for women to continue to fit the stereotype in which they were molded. So I think whatever's in them is more likely to show up. And I would say to them, what I say to anybody, get curious about what is being manifested in this condition.
If there's one thing to take from this, it's that you're not broken. You're human. The way you feel, respond, or struggle often began long before you even had words for it. But awareness is powerful. When we understand the impact of our early experiences, we can stop blaming ourselves and start healing with compassion. You deserve that. So if this resonated with you, know you're not alone. And it's never too late to rewrite your story. Let's keep learning, growing, and healing together.
Healing takes time, and you don't have to do it alone. If this message resonated with you, know that your journey matters. Be gentle with yourself, keep exploring, and surround yourself with support. If you haven't yet, subscribe and join this community. We're in this together. And before you go, comment, "I am healing," to affirm your growth. You are seen, you are valued, and you are not alone. Healing